Drifter Cowboy took in a dying widow until her outlaw husband rode back for blood. A drifter found her dying in the ashes of her burned home, clutching a photograph of the most wanted outlaw in 3 territories, her husband. What Jake McCready didn't know was that saving Sarah Briggs would cost him everything he had left to lose. This is the forgotten legend of a woman who chose love over vengeance, and 2 broken men who learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage is learning how to forgive. The sun bled crimson across the prairie when Jake McCready first saw her. A broken figure sprawled beside the charred bones of what had once been a home. Her dress, once white as Sunday morning, was stained black with soot and red with something darker. She clutched a photograph against her chest like a prayer, her lips moving in whispered words that the wind carried away before Jake could catch them. His horse stamped nervously beneath him, sensing death in the air. The smell of burned wood and something worse hung heavy in the evening stillness. Jake had seen enough burned homesteads in his 34 years to know the work of desperate men, but something about this one made his chest tighten with old familiar pain. The woman's eyes fluttered open as his shadow fell across her face. They were the color of storm clouds, gray and endless, holding depths that spoke of too much sorrow for one life to carry. Her lips parted, and when she spoke, her voice was barely stronger than the whisper of wind through dead grass. "Please," she said, "don't let me die here alone." Jake dismounted without thinking, his boots crunching on glass from shattered windows. He knelt beside her, close enough to see the way her breathing came shallow and quick, like a bird with a broken wing. Her face was pale as winter morning, but her cheeks burned with fever. "What happened here?" he asked, though he already knew the answer written in smoke and ash around them. "They came for him," she whispered, her fingers tightening on the photograph. "But he wasn't here. He's never here when the wolves come calling." Jake's eyes found the picture in her hands, a man with hard eyes and a cruel mouth, the kind of face that looked comfortable with violence. Even in the fading light, he could see the resemblance to wanted posters he'd seen tacked to saloon walls and sheriff's offices from here to Colorado. "Colton Briggs," she said, following his gaze. "My husband." The name hit Jake like a physical blow. Colton Briggs, leader of the Black Creek Gang, a man with blood on his hands and a price on his head that would set a poor cowboy up for life. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but something in the woman's eyes stopped him cold. "He left me," she continued, each word a struggle. "Left me and our little girl to face what he'd brought down on us. But they were too late. She's been in the ground 2 winters now." Her voice broke on the last words, and Jake felt something crack inside his chest. He'd buried his own family once, knew the weight that came with putting earth over the people you loved most. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Briggs. Though I don't know why I still carry his name." The evening air grew colder, and Jake could see her shivering despite the fever that painted her cheeks. He shrugged out of his coat and laid it gently over her, the leather still warm from his body. "Can you sit up?" he asked. She nodded weakly, and Jake helped her rise, feeling how little she weighed, like she was already halfway to becoming a ghost. He pulled his water skin from his saddle and held it to her lips, watching as she drank in small, careful sips. "They burned everything," she said, looking at the ruins that had once been her home. "Said it was a message for Colton. Said he'd know what it meant." Jake followed her gaze to where the chimney stood like a tombstone against the darkening sky. In the ashes near what had been the front door, he could make out the twisted remains of a child's rocking horse, its painted eyes staring blindly at the stars beginning to appear overhead. "Where will you go?" he asked. Sarah's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Where does a woman go when she has nothing left? Where her husband is a ghost, and her daughter is in the ground, and her home is ashes." Jake was quiet for a long moment, listening to the night sound beginning to stir around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, lonesome and wild. He thought of his own cabin, 20 miles north through rough country. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a roof, a place to wait out the storms, but it was clean and warm and safe. I have a place, he said finally. Nothing fancy, but it's got a roof and a fireplace. You're welcome to it until you get your strength back. Sarah's eyes searched his face in the fading light, looking for the trap, the price that would come due later. Jake had seen that look before, in the eyes of cornered animals, and people who'd learned that kindness usually came with a cost. Why, she asked. Why would you help the wife of a man like Colton Briggs? Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and older regrets. Because once upon a time, someone should have helped my wife when she needed it most, he said. And maybe if they had, she'd still be drawing breath. He stood and walked to his horse, returning with a blanket that smelled of sage and wood smoke. He wrapped it around Sarah's shoulders and helped her to her feet, steady and patient as she found her balance. Can you ride? He asked. Sarah nodded, though Jake could see the effort it cost her. He lifted her onto his horse with gentle hands, then swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. She leaned back against his chest, and Jake could feel the way her body trembled with exhaustion and fever. As they rode away from the burned homestead, Sarah turned back once to look at the ruins of her former life. In the moonlight, the ashes looked silver, almost beautiful like snow that would never melt. He'll come back, she whispered, and Jake wasn't sure if it was a promise or a threat. Colton always comes back. And when he does, she didn't finish the thought, but Jake felt her shiver against him, and he knew it had nothing to do with the cold night air settling around them like a shroud. For 3 weeks, the outlaw's dying wife taught him to bake her grandmother's biscuits, until she found his wanted poster hidden beneath his saddle and realized her savior was also a hunted man. 3 weeks passed like whispered prayers in Jake McCready's cabin, and Sarah Briggs learned to live again one careful breath at a time. The fever broke on the 4th day, leaving her weak as a newborn colt but clear-eyed and grateful. Jake tended to her with the quiet devotion of a man who understood that healing took more than medicine. It took time and patience and the kind of gentle attention most folks forgot how to give. The cabin wasn't much to look at from the outside. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that drew smoke clean, windows that Jake had traded his best boots for in a town whose name he'd already forgotten. But inside, it held the warmth that only comes from being truly lived in. Sarah's eyes had widened the first time Jake lit the oil lamp, casting golden light across shelves lined with books whose pages were soft from reading, walls hung with tools kept sharp and clean, and a bed with quilts that smelled of lavender and wood smoke. "It's beautiful," she had whispered that first night, and Jake had felt something loosen in his chest that he didn't know had been tight. Now, as October painted the world in shades of copper and gold, Sarah moved through the cabin like she belonged there. Her strength returned slowly, like a creek filling after drought, but it returned all the same. She swept the floors with a broom Jake had made from prairie grass, humming songs her mother had taught her back when the world was smaller and safer. She mended the tears in his shirts with fingers that remembered how to be steady, and cooked meals that filled the cabin with smells that made Jake's mouth water. "My grandmother taught me to make these," Sarah said one morning, her hands working flour and buttermilk into biscuit dough. She said the secret was in the way you folded the dough, gentle, like you were tucking a baby into bed. Jake watched from the kitchen table, his coffee growing cold in his hands. There was something about the way Sarah moved in his kitchen, the way the morning light caught in her hair, that made him forget about the wanted posters and the price on his head and the reason he'd been running for so long. "What was she like?" he asked. "Your grandmother." Sarah's hands stilled for a moment, and Jake saw the shadow pass across her face that always came when she spoke of family. But then she smiled, and it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. "Strong," she said simply. "Stronger than winter and twice as warm." She buried 3 husbands and raised 7 children and never once complained about the hand life dealt her. Used to say that complaining was like rocking in a chair. It gave you something to do, but it didn't get you anywhere. Jake found himself smiling at that, and Sarah caught the expression, her own smile widening in response. It was the first time he'd smiled in longer than he cared to remember, and the feeling was strange and welcome as rain after a long dry spell. "Tell me about your family," Sarah said as she slid the biscuits into the oven. "You mentioned a wife." The smile faded from Jake's face like frost before sunrise. He was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think she'd overstepped, but then he spoke, his voice soft and careful, as if the words might break. "Her name was Mary," he said. "Mary Catherine. She had hair the color of wheat and a laugh that could make flowers grow in winter." He paused, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers to questions he'd stopped asking. "We had a little spread down in Texas. Nothing fancy, just enough to raise some cattle and maybe a family." "What happened to her?" Sarah asked gently. Jake's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where Sarah had noticed a scar that looked like it came from a bullet. "Range war," he said finally. "Big ranchers didn't like small folks trying to make a go of it. They came one night while I was in town getting supplies. By the time I got home," he shook his head. "Sometimes I think the bullet they put in me was a kindness. Would have been easier than living with what I found." Sarah crossed the cabin and sat beside him at the table, her hand covering his. Her fingers were warm and callous from work, real in a way that made Jake's chest tighten. "How long ago?" she asked. 5 years come Christmas," Jake said. "Been running ever since. Not from the law, exactly, but from the memories. From the smell of smoke and the sound of silence where laughter used to be." They sat quietly together as the morning light grew stronger and the biscuits baked golden in the oven. Outside, the wind stirred the aspen leaves, making them whisper secrets that neither Jake nor Sarah could quite understand. "I had a daughter," Sarah said suddenly. "Emma. She would have been 8 this winter." Her voice was steady, but Jake could see the effort it cost her. "She had her father's eyes and my stubborn streak. Used to follow me everywhere, chattering like a magpie about everything she saw." "What happened to her?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer would break something inside him. "Fever," Sarah said simply. "The winter after Colton rode off with his gang for the first time. I tried everything, herbs, prayers, even rode 20 miles to fetch the doctor. But some things can't be fixed with wanting them to be different." Jake squeezed her hand, understanding passing between them without need for words. They were both haunted people, carrying ghosts that would never quite let them rest. "I buried her under the big cottonwood by the creek," Sarah continued. "Used to sit by her grave and tell her about my days, about the birds I saw and the flowers that came up in spring. Felt like she was still listening, you know." Jake nodded. He knew. The timer Sarah had rigged from an old clock chimed softly, and she rose to pull the biscuits from the oven. They were perfect, golden brown and tall, filling the cabin with the smell of home and comfort. She split one open and handed Jake half, the steam rising between them like incense. "Best biscuit I've had in years," Jake said, and meant it. "Grandmother always said food tastes better when it's made with grateful hands," Sarah replied. After breakfast, Sarah insisted on mending a tear in Jake's winter coat, a long rip in the leather that he'd been meaning to fix for months. She worked carefully, her needle flashing in and out of the tough hide, humming that same tune her mother had taught her. Jake was cleaning his rifle when Sarah's needle slipped, pricking her finger. She gasped and put the finger to her mouth, and when she did, a folded paper fell from the coat's inner pocket. It fluttered to the floor like a wounded bird, landing face up at her feet. "Wanted, Jake McCready. Dead or alive. 500 reward." Sarah's face went white as winter snow. The coat slipped from her lap as she bent to pick up the poster, her hands trembling as she read the charges. "Armed robbery. Murder. Suspected member of the Dalton gang." Jake looked up from his rifle and saw what she held, saw the fear creeping back in her storm-gray eyes. The peace that had settled over the cabin like a warm blanket suddenly felt thin and fragile. "Sarah," he said quietly, setting down his rifle. She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. The man who'd saved her life. The man who'd tended her fever and shared his food and made her laugh again. The man whose face was printed on a wanted poster with a price that would tempt even honest folk. "Who are you?" she whispered. Jake stood slowly, his hands empty and open. Outside, The wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the cabin creak like old bones. In the distance, Sarah could swear she heard the sound of hoofbeats, but when she listened closer, there was nothing but the wind and her own heart beating fast as a frightened bird's. "I'm a man who found you dying and chose to help," Jake said simply. "Everything else is just words on paper." But even as he spoke, they both knew that words on paper had a way of becoming more real than flesh and blood, especially when those words came with a price attached. When Colton Briggs rode into that valley with 3 killers at his back, he expected to find his dying wife. But the outlaw husband never counted on facing the one man who'd already chosen to die for her. They came with the winter wind, for riders cutting through the morning mist like harbingers of Judgment Day. Sarah saw them first from the cabin window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the distant figures emerge from the tree line. Her hand found the windowsill, knuckles white as fresh snow, and when she spoke Jake's name, it came out like a prayer whispered in an empty church. "He's here." Jake set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, the ceramic making no sound against the wooden table. He'd been expecting this moment for weeks, feeling it in his bones the way old wounds ache before storm. But expecting death and welcoming it were 2 different things entirely. He moved to the window and stood beside Sarah, close enough to feel the tremor running through her like a fault line about to give way. The lead rider sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with violence. Even at a distance, Jake could see the family resemblance, the same storm-gray eyes as Sarah, the same stubborn set to the jaw, but where Sarah's features held softness and sorrow, Colton Briggs wore cruelty like a second skin. "How many?" Jake asked quietly. "4," Sarah whispered. "Colton and 3 of his men. I recognize them. Tommy Vance, the one with the scar. Billy Corrigan rides the paint horse. And that's Frank Dalton bringing up the rear." Jake's blood went cold at the last name. Frank Dalton, brother to the famous Outlaws, and meaner than a rattlesnake in a rainstorm. If Colton had brought Frank Dalton to this fight, he wasn't planning on leaving any loose ends. "Sarah," Jake said, his voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. "There's a root cellar under the kitchen floor. Hidden panel by the stove. You get down there and you don't come up no matter what you hear." Sarah turned to face him, and Jake was startled by the steel in her eyes. The broken woman he'd found in the ashes 3 weeks ago was gone, replaced by someone harder, someone who'd learned that survival sometimes meant making choices that would haunt you forever. "No," she said simply. "Sarah, these men, I know exactly what these men are," she cut him off. "I was married to their leader for 7 years. I know what they do to people who cross them, and I know what they'll do to you if they take you alive." She walked to the mantel and took down Jake's spare rifle, checking the action with hands that knew their way around weapons. "My daddy taught me to shoot before I could properly hold a book. And Colton made sure I stayed in practice." The hoofbeats were closer now, close enough to hear the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. Jake could make out individual faces, hard men with cold eyes and hands that rested easy on their guns. Men who'd killed before and would kill again without losing sleep over it. "Jake McCready," Colton's voice carried across the valley like the crack of a whip. "I know you're in there, and I know you got something that belongs to me." Jake stepped onto the porch, his hands empty but ready, Sarah beside him with the rifle held loose but purposeful. The 4 riders arranged themselves in a rough semicircle, cutting off any chance of escape. Colton sat his black stallion like a king on a throne, his coat open despite the cold to show the matched Colts on his hips. He was older than the wanted poster suggested, lined around the eyes and gray at the temples. But his hand was steady and his gaze was sharp, and when he smiled it was the kind of expression that made small children hide behind their mother's skirts. "Sarah, darling," Colton said, his voice honey-sweet and poison-deadly. "You're looking better than I expected. Good to see my investment in a nursemaid paid off." "I'm not your investment," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the space between them clear and cold. "I stopped being yours the day you left me and Emma to burn." Colton's smile faltered for just a moment, and Jake caught a glimpse of something almost human in the outlaw's eyes. Pain, maybe, or regret. But it was gone before Jake could be sure it had ever been there at all. Now, that's harsh word from a woman talking to her lawful husband, Colton said, especially considering I rode all this way to bring you home. Home? Sarah's laugh was bitter as alkali water. You mean the pile of ashes you left me in? The grave where I buried our daughter while you were off playing outlaw with your friends. Frank Dalton shifted in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his gun. Boss, we didn't come here to job out family problems. Let's take care of business and get moving. But Colton held up a hand, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. I had debts, Sarah. Bad debts to worse men. The Pinkertons were closing in, and I had to choose between running or watching them burn down everything we'd built. So you chose to burn it down yourself, Sarah said. You chose to leave us with nothing but enemies and ashes. I chose to keep you alive. Colton's voice cracked like a pistol shot. You think those men wouldn't have put bullets in you and Emma just to make a point? You think I wanted to leave my family? You wanted to leave us the minute you chose that life, Sarah said. The minute you decided that easy money was worth more than hard work and honest living. Jake had been quiet through the exchange, watching the pain play across both their faces like shadows from a dying fire. But now Frank Dalton was getting restless, and Billy Corrigan's hand was creeping toward his gun, and Jake knew that talking time was about over. Colton, he said quietly, stepping forward. You've got your say. Now here's mine. Sarah's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go. And if you're smart, you'll turn those horses around and ride back the way you came. Colton's attention swung to Jake like the barrel of a rifle finding its target. And you are. Jake McCready. Recognition flickered in Colton's eyes, followed by something that might have been respect. Jake McCready. Heard you rode with the Daltons for a spell. Frank, you know this man? Frank Dalton spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Know of him. Good with a gun, better with his fists. Heard he went soft after some trouble down in Texas. That trouble have anything to do with a dead wife and a burned-out ranch? Colton asked, his voice suddenly gentle. Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Thought so, Colton said. Well, Jake McCready, I can respect a man who's been where you've been. But that don't change the facts. Sarah's my wife, legal and proper, and I'm taking her home. The hell you are, Sarah said, and the rifle in her hands wasn't loose anymore. It was pointed right at her husband's heart, steady as bedrock and twice as hard. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through winter grass and the nervous stamp of horses sensing the tension in the air. For men with guns faced one man and one woman, and Jake knew that in about 30 seconds, lead would start flying and good people would die. But Sarah wasn't finished talking. You want the truth, Colton? She said, her voice carrying across the valley like Judgment Day. Here's truth. You killed our daughter just as sure as if you'd put a bullet in her yourself. You killed her when you chose that life, when you brought those enemies to our door, when you left us alone to face what you'd set in motion. Colton's face went white as winter snow. Sarah, and you kill me too, she continued, tears streaming down her cheeks but her voice never wavering. You killed the woman who loved you, who believed in you, who would have followed you to hell and back if you just asked. That woman died in the ashes of our home, and she ain't coming back no matter how many men you bring to fetch her. The rifle in her hands never moved, still pointed straight at Colton's heart. Jake could see her finger on the trigger, could see the resolve in her storm-gray eyes, and he knew that Sarah Briggs had reached the end of her rope and tied a noose with what was left. So here's how this ends, she said. You turn those horses around and ride away, and we'll call it even. Or you try to take me, and I'll put you in the ground right beside the man I used to love. In the silence that followed, Jake heard the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead, and he wondered if it would be the last sound he'd ever hear. She stepped between the bullets meant for the man who saved her, and in dying, Sarah Briggs finally taught two broken outlaws what it meant to choose love over vengeance. The first shot came from Tommy Vance, the man with the scar who'd grown tired of waiting for words to settle what bullets could finish in seconds. His Colt cleared leather smooth and fast. But Jake McCready had been expecting it, had seen the tell in Tommy's eyes a heartbeat before he drew. Jake's own gun was in his hand before Tommy's shot went wide, and his return fire took the scarred man clean off his horse. But Tommy's shot had broken the spell of silence, and suddenly the morning exploded into chaos. Frank Dalton's gun roared like thunder, Billy Corrigan's paint horse reared and screamed, and Colton Briggs found himself caught between his wife's rifle and the violence he'd brought to her door. Jake dove sideways off the porch as Frank's bullet splintered the wood where his head had been. He rolled behind a water trough, feeling splinters shower down like deadly rain. Sarah's rifle cracked once, twice, and Billy Corrigan pitched forward in his saddle, clutching a shoulder that bloomed red through his coat. Enough! Colton's voice cut through the gunfire like a blade. He sat his black stallion in the middle of the chaos, his matched Colts still holstered, his eyes locked on Sarah's face. Enough killing. But Frank Dalton wasn't listening to anyone but the devil on his shoulder. He'd rolled off his horse and taken cover behind a fallen log, and Jake could see him drawing a bead on Sarah where she knelt behind the porch railing. The angle was perfect. She was focused on her husband, didn't see the death creeping up on her blind side. Time slowed to honey-thick seconds as Jake saw Frank's finger tighten on the trigger. Jake was moving before he consciously decided to, launching himself across the open ground between the water trough and the porch, knowing he'd never make it in time, but trying anyway, because Sarah Briggs deserved better than dying alone. Frank's gun roared just as Jake reached the porch steps, just as Sarah turned and saw the danger, just as Colton Briggs finally understood what was about to happen to the woman he'd never stopped loving despite all the poison between them. But Sarah saw it too. Saw Jake throwing himself into harm's way for her sake, saw the bullet meant for her heart flying straight and true. And in that crystalline moment between heartbeats, Sarah Briggs made the last choice of her life. She stepped into the path of Frank Dalton's bullet. The impact spun her around like a child's top, and she fell against Jake with a sound like a sigh escaping. Her blood was warm against his chest, spreading across his shirt like spilled wine. Jake caught her as she fell, cradling her head as they both went down in a tangle of arms and grief. Sarah, Colton's voice broke like a dam giving way. He was off his horse and running toward them, his guns forgotten, his hands reaching for the woman who'd just died to save another man's life. Frank Dalton tried to lever another round, but Colton's boot caught him in the ribs and sent him sprawling. The outlaw leader's Colt was in his hand faster than thought. The barrel pressed against Frank's forehead hard enough to leave a mark. She was my wife, Colton said, his voice quiet as winter morning and twice as deadly. My wife, and you shot her like a dog in the dirt. Boss, Frank gasped. I was aiming for it, the Colt roared once, and Frank Dalton's words ended forever. Billy Corrigan, clutching his wounded shoulder, looked at his dead companions and made the smart choice. He spurred his paint horse and rode hard for the tree line, never once looking back. Smart men knew when to cut their losses and run. Jake held Sarah in his arms as her life leaked away into the dirt. Her storm-gray eyes were still clear, still fierce, but her breathing was shallow and getting shallower. Blood frothed at the corners of her mouth, and Jake knew she didn't have long. Colton knelt beside them, his hands hovering over his dying wife like he wanted to touch her, but didn't know if he still had the right. His face was wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. Sarah, he whispered. Oh God, Sarah, what have I done? She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment Jake saw the woman she'd been before grief and betrayal had carved the softness from her features. She lifted one trembling hand and touched Colton's cheek, her fingers coming away wet with his tears. I forgave you a long time ago, she whispered, her voice barely stronger than whined through grass. I forgot how to tell you. Colton caught her hand and pressed it against his heart, and Jake felt like he was intruding on something sacred and private. But Sarah's other hand found his, her fingers lacing through his with surprising strength. Take care of him, she said, her eyes moving from Jake to Colton and back again. Take care of each other. Promise me. Sarah, don't, Jake started. Promise me, she repeated, and there was steel in her voice even as her body failed her. The hate stops here. The running stops here. Promise me you'll find a better way. Jake looked across her body at Colton Briggs. This man he should have been fighting, this outlaw whose crimes had filled wanted posters from here to California. But all Jake saw was a broken husband holding his dying wife's hand and weeping like the world was ending. I promise, Jake said. Colton, Sarah's eyes had found her husband's face again. Do you remember what you said the day we got married? About being the kind of man worthy of my love. Colton nodded, unable to speak. Be that man now, she whispered. For me. For Emma. For yourself. Her breathing hitched, stuttered, and Jake felt her hand go slack in his. Sarah Briggs died as the sun climbed higher into the winter sky, her blood staining the earth she'd fought so hard to defend, her last words hanging in the air like a benediction. For a long time, neither man moved. They knelt there in the dirt, holding the hands of a woman who'd saved them both, listening to the wind whisper through the grass and watching the hawks circle overhead. When Colton finally spoke, his voice was hoarse with grief. I never meant for any of this to happen, he said. I was trying to protect her, trying to keep her safe from the life I'd chosen. But I just brought the danger right to her door. She knew, Jake said quietly. She knew you were trying to protect her. That's why she forgave you. They buried Sarah Briggs on a hill overlooking the valley, where wildflowers would grow come spring and the wind would sing her lullabies. Jake said words over her grave, not a proper preacher's words, but words from the heart about love and sacrifice and the price of redemption. Colton stood beside him, hat in his hands, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on his cheeks. When it was done, Colton walked to his horse and pulled his gun belt from the saddle. He laid the matched Colts on Sarah's grave like an offering, the leather dark with years of wear and violence. I'm done, he said simply. Done running, done fighting, done being the man who brought death to everything he touched. Jake watched as Colton mounted his black stallion one last time. The outlaw looked older somehow, worn down by grief and the weight of choices that could never be undone. Where will you go? Jake asked. Colton looked out across the valley where Sarah had found peace in Jake's cabin, where she'd learned to smile again and make biscuits that tasted like home. There's a town in Oregon, he said, place called Redemption. Seems like a good place for a man to start over. He turned his horse toward the west, then looked back at Jake one last time. You take care of yourself, Jake McCready. And remember what you promised her. Jake nodded, his throat too tight for words. As Colton rode away, Jake stood alone beside Sarah's grave in the growing warmth of the morning sun. In his pocket, he carried the photograph she'd been clutching when he found her. Not the picture of Colton anymore, but a new one he'd sketched of her laughing in his kitchen, flower in her hair, and joy in her storm-gray eyes. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of spring still months away. Somewhere in the distance, that hawk called again, no longer a harbinger of death, but a herald of something new beginning. Jake pulled his hat low and walked back toward the cabin, toward the home Sarah had helped him remember how to build. Behind him, the prairie grass whispered her name to the wind, and the earth held her close, and the morning stretched golden and endless toward whatever came next.